is the third of my Thames Torso murder films, and I'm now in a district of London just on the south bank called Horselydown. No one knows it really is Horselydown now, the name's lost. The church, St John Horselydown, was blitzed in the war, and all we have left is the plinth here that you can see that a later church mission was built on it in the 60s, and the last bits were demolished apart from the plinth. It was a very nice Hawksmoor church for those that want to delve into the mysteries of Hawksmoor, like St George in the east and like Christchurch Spitalfields. And just so you know where Horselydown is, behind me we can see Tower Bridge, the southern approach, and over here this is the remains of St John Horselydown Church. So Horselydown is supposed to mean horse, literally horse lie down. It's a place where a pasture for horses next to the river, next to the city, near the bridge, the old London Bridge, access from the south into the city, especially where the horses grazed. But Horselydown Lane, one of the few reminders, the river's down here. And Horselydown Old Stairs, that's all really that's left of the district of Horselydown. This is the Horselydown part of the Thames foreshore. The bank I'm standing on, the embankment I'm standing on, wasn't actually here then. It was much tighter in, and here there was a set of stairs called the George Stairs, which led down to the shore. A man called John Regan was on the shore. He saw 3 kids throwing stones at a parcel which was laying in the water about 3 yards out. He pulled it in, opened it up, and he found that inside were 4 parts of a woman's lower abdomen. He called PC Freshwater, who was passing on a boat. They took the body parts to Thames Division Police Station on Wapping, on the banks of the River Thames. The Dr McCoy, the local divisional doctor, came and had a look at it, as did the famous Dr Thomas Bond. We're 5 miles away from Horselydown, and at roughly the same time, on the same day, a young lad, 15-year-old lad called Isaac Brett, who is from Chelsea on the other side, was swimming at the base of the Albert Bridge here with some of his friends, swimming in the river on this hot day in June. Now, he saw something floating in the river. Now, I would always recommend, if you see something floating, a floater in the sea or in the lake or the river, I would normally recommend ignoring it, but he didn't. He dragged it ashore, and he could tell it had something strange inside. This package was wrapped in a part of an Ulster coat. He was advised by a passerby to take it to Battersea police station, which he did, and when he took it there, it was inspected by the sergeant. He opened it and found it contained the thigh of a lady. It was wrapped, as I said, in an ulster, and there was also some underwear within this package. On the waistband of these the underwear, the bloomers, was a name inked in pen. It was a name, L.E. Fisher, a very definitive potential clue. We're at St Mary's Church, Battersea, right on the river. It's a famous church, partly because the hero of the American Rebellion, Benedict Arnold, is buried there. And St Mary's, because it's right by the river, is the first parish to have an independent mortuary attached to it, which was on the site roughly where we're standing here. It's right by the river there, and it was useful because of the bodies that would get washed up. They'd be able to put them straight in the mortuary. And there was a pub on the main road over there, which we'll see the location in a minute, called Star and Garter, where they used to hold the inquests. So it was all It was all a convenient location. Anyway, this mortuary was where they assembled the body parts for this particular gruesome murder. The divisional surgeon for this police area, Dr. Kempster, was brought in. He had also been involved in looking at the parts for the Rainham torso, we discussed him earlier, along with Dr. Bond, and they looked at the part that was found by the Albert Bridge, the thigh, and gave it a close inspection. In the mortuary, they inspected the thigh that was found by the Albert Bridge, and they noticed that there was 4 fingerprint bruises on the thigh caused before death, probably by the culprit holding the victim down immediately prior to killing them. And the part from Horselydown was also brought here. The parts from Horselydown were also brought here, and Bond noticed that there was blood oozing out. Again, gave him the idea that it was a freshly killed. They thought at the time probably about 24 hours, about the 3rd of June, and Bond was initially of the opinion that it looked like an illegal operation, an abortion had taken place and gone wrong, and that's why the body had been cut up and disposed of. There was some other interesting information that Bond wrote later in a book called A System of Legal Medicine, where he referred to some of the body parts that were found at Horselydown, where he said there were flaps of skin and subcutaneous tissues consisting of 2 long irregular slips taken from the abdominal walls. These flaps of skin, which are reminiscent of what happened in the murder of Mary Kelly. It was determined that the part from the Albert Bridge and the part from Horselydown were from the same body. Dr. Kempster preserved them in spirits in the mortuary. The case was put in the hands of Inspector Reagan of the Thames Division and Inspector Tonbridge of Scotland Yard, who had been brought in. It was also determined that both parts were wrapped in bits of the same Ulster jacket, and both parts were also wrapped in the same underwear, same parts of the same underwear. So it was clearly, there's no dispute that they were the same victim. And the shoreline was patrolled. The Thames Division were closely looking at the shores, and they even dragged the river by Vauxhall Bridge. On the 6th of June, the inquest over the body parts that have been found so far was held at the Wapping Vestry Hall, which used to stand on this corner behind me. Wyn Baxter was the coroner. Now, Wyn Baxter, many of you will know, was a coroner very much involved in a lot of the Whitechapel murders. He'd been in charge of proceedings for Emma Smith, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Rose Milet, Alice Mackenzie. Soon he was going to do the Pinchin Street torso also, and he also was in charge of the inquest for Francis Coles. The inquest at Wapping Vestry adjourned on the 6th, but that same day on the foreshore here in Battersea, we've got Chelsea Bridge over here, what's now Chelsea Bridge. We've got the what's now the Grosvenor Railway Bridge over there, right next to Battersea Park, and a man called Marlowe found in the water, bobbing in the water, the upper part of a torso by a place called Covington's Wharf, is owned by a guy called Covington. He flagged down a passing Thames policeman called Law on his boat, and he took it to Battersea police station. We're back in Battersea Park on the 6th of June, about 2 p.m. A gardener who was employed in the park, called Joseph Davis, was working in a private area. It would have been this area here, which was where they tended their own plants. They had frames in there, they had a fence around it, a wooden fence, there's a metal fence around it. 25 yards inside this private area, he was looking and he saw in some shrubs a suspicious package that gave off a horrible smell. It was about 200 yards from the gate over there, 200 yards from the river over there. Inside the bundle was the upper part of a woman's torso, including the breasts. He recoiled in horror. And the bundle, interestingly enough, had been tied up with Venetian blind cord. I've given a lot of reference to Venetian blind cord. There was even a Venetian blind factory near where Rose Mylett was killed, interestingly enough. Now, there's been a lot of interest in where the location was. I'm absolutely certain it was in this location where the body was found, because it's shown on maps as the only separate area with a fence around it within the park. It gives reference in the reports to frames, which are the frames that they grew their specialist plants on. It would have been within this area here. A local policeman was called. It was taken to Battersea police station in a gardener's basket. It was determined it had been sawn through when it was taken to the mortuary, and compared to the other parts, had been sawn through with a fine bladed saw, and it matched the other body parts inevitably. Due to the state of decomposition, it was thought that the body had been killed around the 1st or 2nd of June. So we're still on the 6th of June. We're now moved to 9 Elms. This area was called Palace Wharf. Area's changed a great deal since then. Just over the road there is the United States Embassy. Down here we've got Battersea Power Station, so we can see we're very close to Torso Central. Now, on that day, on the foreshore here, a man called King found some pieces of flesh that were part of the same torso. Now, interestingly, or inevitably actually, as the case progressed, you find out less and less detail, because the press gets a bit bored with all these different bits popping up. You get less and less detail about what actual body parts, but they were pieces of flesh were found on the foreshore here as well. This is West India Pier, obviously, and just over in here was West India Buoy. On the 7th of June, Edward Stow, a lighterman on the river, saw a parcel floating. He fished it out. It was the sleeve of an Ulster jacket, and when he looked inside, it was the right leg of a woman. He got in touch with the police, Inspector Hodson of the Thames Division, who took this leg away to Dr. Kempster. And just so you get your bearings, we've got West India Pier here, and over there on that corner where those people are walking past now, that is Manilla Street, which we'll be visiting a bit later on in the film, but bear that in mind. This is the 7th of June, back at Palace Wharf in 9 Elms, and on the muddy foreshore here, a man called David Goodman found what were the lungs of the same body. Slowly the pieces are coming together. On the 7th of June, still the 7th of June, we're the furthest west we've been by quite a long way. We're just around the corner there is Wandsworth Bridge. This is, it says, Fulham, and Battersea itself is a good mile in this direction. There's a guy called Solomon Hearn who was an itinerant, what you call a tramp or a scavenger or traveller. There was a lot of these people that lived on the river scavenging for stuff that was left on the mud flats at low tide, and he lived on a thing called the Lammas ground, which was a common grazing area. This area still had common grazing areas. Off the road there called Townmead Road, it was the Town Mead or Lammas ground. He lived in a tent, and he was scavenging on the river here on the mud flat, and he found a leg cut below the knee, wrapped up in an ulster, which was given to Kempster and preserved in spirits along with the rest of the body. Saturday the 8th of June. Now we're on Bankside, which is just opposite the city, on the south bank. The location we're on, it was called Phoenix Wharf. It was just next to what is now the Millennium Bridge, the Wobbly Bridge here. Quite a long way, well, I say quite a long way, about half a mile to the west of Tower Bridge, which I've been saying repeatedly. We've seen Tower Bridge in a number of bits of footage already. Tower Bridge was a sort of blockage, a bottleneck, and I suspect these pieces couldn't get further down. This was as far as they could get, and it ended up washed on the shore. What was it? Bobbing in the river? It was the left arm. A man called Chidley Lightman found it, reported it to the police, was taken to Kempster in Battersea. So it was a well-formed arm, and it had inoculation marks on it. So there was a bit of a clue there. They were starting to get clues about who the potential victim might be. At 12:30 on the 8th of June, in this stretch of river off Battersea Park, halfway between Battersea Pier and Albert Bridge, in the middle of the channel, Thames policeman Inspector Churcher found floating, unwrapped, part of the torso, the lower part of the torso. Now this part, the interesting feature to it, that in the back passage of the torso was a folded piece of linen. It was referred to thereafter as a nameless indignity inflicted upon the victim. Over that wall over there, that's the Chelsea embankment, and over that wall is the River Thames. On the 8th of June, roughly about 12:30, I've told you, Inspector Churcher, in the middle of the channel over there, picked up quite a large body part that was floating in the water. Now, more or less exactly at the same time, a journalist called Claude Mellor was walking down the road here. He was passing a building which was over on this corner over here, which was called the Shelley House. It was where Sir Percy Shelley lived, who was the son, he'd let it out to somebody else at the time in fact, but he owned the property. It was called the Shelley House, and Sir Percy Shelley was the son of Percy Bysshe Shelley, the very famous poet, and his wife Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. There's a bit of irony in this. Frankenstein is a monster that was all bits of body parts put together to create a monster, whereas the story here of the torso, a body's been taken apart. In the garden in front of this house that was there at the time, Claude Mellor walked past and he saw through the railings in some bushes what he thought was a body. He attracted the attention of a local policeman. Mellor and PC Jones went to the stable block around the side here, got into the garden, picked up the package. They didn't open it. They took it to the local mortuary where it was unwrapped. Inside the package was a thigh and, strangely enough, part of a costermonger's apron. Part of the pocket of a costermonger's apron, which is a bit of a strange detail. Now, some people have thought that the culprit deliberately placed this thigh in the wrappings in the garden of the Shelley house to attract attention, because he was a sort of he was actually a very minor celebrity. He was the son of a quite a long dead by that stage celebrity. Sir Percy Shelley himself wasn't very famous. I find it very unlikely that it was deliberately placed there to cause a bit of a stink, because just up the road here Oscar Wilde was living, and even though this was before Oscar Wilde was particularly famous, he was a lot more famous even in 1889 than Sir Percy Shelley was. The reason why I think it was a random and it wasn't deliberately chosen was they used to get a lot of itinerants living on this on the banks here. I think it's most likely that the culprit was coming down, wanted to dispose of it. He couldn't because there's too many people about. He saw a policeman or something like that, and he just chucked it through the hedge. The hedge showed signs of damage where this body part had been thrown through. One of the interesting things is the tide is out at the moment. It's dark. I don't know if you can see it, but it's about it's got to be a 30-foot drop down there to the river at the moment, and how they were disposed of and how they were placed in the river is an interesting conundrum. One thing I'll draw attention to soon as I'm here in the daylight. If you look over, we're almost at high tide. The river's got about another couple of feet it could come up, but maybe another 3 or 4 feet it would come up. We're almost at high tide, and the water level is not that far below where I am here. It's my opinion that the torso murderer dumped pieces of the body over the edge, not necessarily here but further down the river, from the bank rather than from a bridge. If we look at the bridge over here, there would have been a long drop. Even at high tide there'd be a very long drop from the bridge parapet down to the water, and I feel that with the force of the body parts hitting the water wrapped up in the ulsters or whatever they were wrapped up in would have caused the wrapping to come loose if it had hit such a height. So it's my feeling that it just dropped it here, and it would create much less of a splash just dropping it over like this on probably the high tide, so it got tended to get carried down the river with the tide. That's how I think he probably disposed of these body parts. On the 10th of June, Bond, Kempster and Dr. Hebert met here at the mortuary for a conference to look at all the pieces that they had found so far, nearly the entire corpse by now, to have a close look at all their findings. Hebert, who made a particular study of the torso murders, describes, I'm going back to these flaps of skin, 2 large flaps of skin, the uterus and placenta, both arms, hands, legs, both thighs, both legs and feet. The trunk divided into 3 parts. Now, just the head, the intestines, the heart and lungs were missing. The chest was opened down the middle. That's why with a saw. That is why the torso was in so many different parts. Not just cut this way, it was cut that way as well. The arms and legs were neatly disarticulated here, for example, very neatly done with quite a degree of precision, which led them to believe that it was the work not of a doctor but of perhaps a knacker or someone, or a trained butcher. The flaps of skin that I've been going on about came from the abdominal walls, by the way. The fetus was missing, and the woman was 7 months pregnant, roughly 6 or 7 months pregnant. The skin of the victim was fair, the hair sandy coloured. She was about 5 foot 5 inches tall, they thought, and around 25 years of age. They now were of the belief that the death occurred around the 1st or 2nd of June. There were no signs that the victim had engaged in any sort of strenuous manual labour, and her clothes were clearly second-hand but were of decent quality. We're now on the 10th of June, and it's the last find for this torso. We're back on Bankside, opposite St Paul's Cathedral. Just down here is Blackfriars Bridge. We're a little bit west of the earlier find on Bankside. Now, this location, there was a wharf owned by a man called Newton. A lighterman was working there called Squires. he found bobbing in the water, unwrapped on this occasion, an arm. It was the right arm, tied up like this, cut here obviously, tied at the wrist, between the wrist and the shoulder. The fist was clenched like the person, the victim, had been in excruciating pain at that moment of death. There was also marks of ring marks on the finger. The ring was no longer there, they'd been removed. There were ring marks on the finger. Squires flagged down a passing Thames policeman on the river, who took it to Kempster in Battersea. The police even brought in the dog Smoker, the Spitzbergen Terrier owned by journalist Jasper Waring, that had discovered the body parts in the vault at Scotland Yard that the police had missed, that I covered in my last film, my last Torso film. And they brought the dog Smoker in to sniff around the area of Battersea Park near where the body part had been found in the shrubbery. But it was too late. There was no scent. It was an unsuccessful effort. As there was heightened awareness and a general hue and cry around London and the river looking for body parts, various bits did inevitably turn up that were unconnected, that caused a bit of a sensation at the time, such as a liver that was found floating in the Thames, was unconnected, and even a fetus in a jar bobbing around in the river, but that was again unconnected. These misleading cases like this always occur with these torso murders. This is the old Battersea police station. Actually, it's the same site as where the one was in 1889. That one was built in 1858. It was knocked down. It was not a very good building, and this particular version was built in 1911. But this is the site, the Battersea police station, where the main inquiry was run into this murder. The Ellie Fisher Lee, the writing on the underwear that were found, was the best lead, but it led nowhere. They tried to trace people called Ellie Fisher to no avail. Eventually they held a conference at Scotland Yard. Present at this conference was Robert Anderson, Melville McNaughton and Inspector Tunbridge. They decided to reproduce a facsimile of this, the writing that was in the underwear, and reproduce it in newspapers, so hopefully someone would see it and come forward. As a result of this conference, the press on the 13th of June issued a very detailed description of the victim. She was between 24 and 26 years of age, about 5'4" to 5'6" tall, well built, fair skin, light brown to sandy hair, nails bitten down, ring marks on her finger, 4 vaccination marks on her arm, and 7 months pregnant. The clothing, detailed description of the clothing as well, including the ulster. This is a very detailed description that would greatly aid in identification. They also confirmed that the body had been tied up in bootlaces and Venetian blind cord, and that people could come between 10 AM and 4 PM to Battersea police station to view the clothes, and they could even view the remains. On Saturday the 16th of June, the inquest reconvened in Battersea at a pub called the Star and Garter, which stood round about here opposite the church. As I said, convenient location. It's where they always held the inquests in Battersea, and why the mortuary was built there. Now, the coroner now was Braxton Hicks. He was a coroner who dealt with some of the previous cases, particularly Rainham. He was moved here from the Vestry, Wapping, because most of the body parts were found down this end and not in Wapping. So Win Baxter gave up control of it, and it was now under Braxton Hicks. Braxton Hicks saw no less than 23 witnesses that day, from the police, from witnesses who found body parts, for medical opinion. Dr. Bond was there, and so was Inspector Tunbridge from Scotland Yard. Bond was the most interesting witness. He confirmed he'd been put onto the case by Robert Anderson from Scotland Yard. He confirmed that the head would most likely sink, which hadn't been found obviously. The coroner asked him whether drugs could have been used to help cause an abortion brought on by drugs. He said he couldn't form an opinion on that because the relevant body parts that could tell that weren't there. He also, initially, he had, as I've mentioned, he gave the opinion that he thought that the victim was one of an illegal operation, an abortion, but he clarified now that he no longer believed that. That was no longer the case. If it was an abortion, that's why there was the question about drugs being used to procure an abortion. If it was an abortion, it wasn't one through an operation, through cutting the body open. He could determine that. So that can pretty much be ruled out. It was not a case of an abortion gone wrong. It was Bond's final opinion, really, that the body had been destroyed in that way to conceal the identity, not as a result of an operation. There was one other interesting witness called John Fincham, who was a fireman, who came forward and said he saw the package in Battersea Park, the one in the shrubbery by the frames in behind the fence. He saw that the day before, so it had clearly been there a little bit longer, but he hadn't come forward at the time. The case hadn't progressed any further as far as the investigation is concerned, so the coroner adjourned it until the 1st of July. Soon after the inquest and all the news reports which gave a description of the victim in great detail, a woman called Catherine Jackson came forward and came to the mortuary at St Mary's and viewed the body parts and identified it quite clearly as her daughter Elizabeth, based on some cut scars on her wrists primarily. She was also pregnant. She was 24, she was 5 feet 5 inches tall. Everything matched, even the fact that she had rings on her finger from a sort of bogus marriage. Elizabeth was from Chelsea, just over the river. She had lived a good and steady life for most of her life, in service, in houses, but had gone off the rails the previous November and had seemingly turned to prostitution. Elizabeth seems to have taken up with a pimp called Charlie, and then got with a man called Fairclough, moved out seemingly with him to Ipswich, where he bought her some clothes. These clothes, second-hand clothes, had the markings Ellie Fisher on them, so that clears up where those clothes came from. After a while, Elizabeth and John Fairclough moved back down to London, to the Isle of Dogs actually, to Manilla Street, which is where we are right now. They had a lodging house here. They were living as passing themselves off as husband and wife. She wore a brass ring that he'd given her, but eventually she got pregnant, and eventually they split up. He went down to Croydon to get work. She then did a moonlit flit, owing a week's rent. On the 28th of April, she moved back to West London. She was about 5 months pregnant. After leaving the Isle of Dogs, Elizabeth came back to Chelsea and probably slept rough some of the time on the river, on the embankment, and she also stayed in Turk's Row in a lodging house, and she was certainly seen in Turk's Row by her sister Annie, and her sister, she talked to a man, and her sister Annie believed she was soliciting and leading an improper lifestyle, and they had the last time they saw each other, bad words were spoken between them. There were certainly a lot of soldiers and barracks in this area, so it probably was a good place for a prostitute to go soliciting. Elizabeth also bumped into one of her mother's friends on Chain Row here, and she lent her some money and gave her an ulster, the coat that was to be cut up, and her body parts were wrapped up in it and found in the river. On the 31st of May, a day or two before she was murdered, Elizabeth bumped into her mother on this road, Queen's Road it was called. Now it's called Royal Hospital Road. She bumped into her. She had been avoiding her because she was embarrassed to see her and tell her about what had happened to her and the fact that she was pregnant. But they bumped into each other on this road, and Elizabeth tried to avoid her initially. They had a conversation, and it all gushed out. Elizabeth confessed that she was pregnant. She showed her she had this brass ring on her finger. She'd had this form of marriage with this guy who had gone and absconded, and that was the last time her mother saw her. When the inquest reconvened on the 1st of July in the Star and Garter, which was over there, the main witnesses, this time seen by Braxton Hicks, were the family of Elizabeth Jackson, who gave accounts of her movement. But the one man who was missing, the one man who had been in close proximity to her in her final weeks, John Fairclough, had not yet been identified. He had been in the 3rd Battalion of Grenadier Guards. He'd got in trouble. He'd been done for desertion on occasion. So the police wanted to find Fairclough, if only to eliminate him from their inquiries. So again, the inquest was adjourned until he could be located. There had been reports, after all, that Fairclough had ill-used Elizabeth. He had passed her off as his wife, given her a brass ring, so there was every reason to want to see him. All the medical evidence having been taken and having been reassured that he wouldn't be likely to be able to find the head, the coroner allowed the remains, the very many different parts of Elizabeth Jackson, to be buried finally. On the 25th of July, the final session of the inquest took place in the Star and Garter. By now, John Fairclough had been found. He had a full alibi for his entire time. There's no way he could have done the murder. He was totally cleared. Inspector Tunbridge confirmed this to the satisfaction of the coroner and the jury. The coroner instructed the jury, or recommended to the jury, that they pass a verdict of willful murder by persons unknown, and that is what they did. Well, we're back in the crime scene room. Now, to illustrate on a map for you the murder of Elizabeth Jackson is quite a complicated thing to do, because the body parts was spread over such a wide area, from Wandsworth Bridge to West India Dock Pier. Quite a wide area. To get a map, I had to get these two different maps. Well, it's one map, but it's in two sheets, and lay them together, because I didn't have one that neatly showed it, because it's just a wide area, such an awkward area to illustrate. Also, there were 12 body parts, 12 different parts were found, which makes it very complicated. And I want to illustrate to you the other, how they interrelate to the other body parts that were found for the two preceding torsos, the Rainham Mystery and the Whitehall Mystery, and the Pinchin Street torso, which came slightly afterwards. And I want to show you the locations, because we know the victim, in this case Elizabeth Jackson. I want to illustrate to you the locations that we know where she was seen or living, which interrelate with where the body parts were found. And there's more information to tell you about the Elizabeth Jackson, because we know who she was. So it's quite complex. all the bits on the map at the moment. I'm going to take them off and put them back on so you see how it developed. But you can see how complex it is. It's also over quite a tight time frame for Elizabeth Jackson. It was 7 days between the first body part being found on the 4th of June, the first part, 2 parts, and the last one on the 10th of June. Although the parts weren't found on every single day. There were some days when nothing was found at all. But I'm going to go through that for you now. So now I'm going to go through the sequence for the how the body parts, which were Elizabeth Jackson, turned up on the map. I'm going to show you how it happened. So the first part, I'm going to use white pawns for, mostly I'm going to use white pawns for the parts that were turned up on water, but I've only got 8 white pawns, so bear with me on this. So the first part turned up 4th of June, floating off George Stairs, Horselydown, about here. The upper torso split into 4 parts. The next part was found by the lad swimming off Albert Bridge. That was the left thigh here. That was also on the 4th of June. 5th of June, nothing happened. 6th of June, Covington's Wharf, which is right next to what is now Chelsea Bridge. The top part of the torso, another top part of the torso is found off Covington's Wharf here, floating. The next piece that came to light, also on the 6th of June, was in Battersea Park itself, in the shrubbery. That area I identified where the frames were, where they did tendering, like a nursery within the park. There, on the 6th. Again on the 6th, another small piece of lungs was found by Palace Wharf, 9 Elms, which is about here. The next piece was found on the 7th, and this was the part that was found by the scavenger at Wandsworth Bridge, about here. I'm using black because I haven't got enough white, but it was actually found in the river. I'm using that to show that's the far west marker, the farthest west part that was ever found. And that was the left leg below the knee. Then again at Palace Wharf, again we had 2 parts at Palace Wharf, 9 Elms. Some flesh was again found there on the same day, the 7th. And again on the 7th, bit of a busy day, West India Dock, way over here. I'm using the black again as the eastern marker of West India Pier, West India Buoy, over here. And that was the right leg and foot. Then we have floating off Bankside was the left arm. This is the next day, the 8th, near the Wobbly Bridge, about here. What is now the Wobbly Bridge, it wasn't there obviously at the time. Then we have the part that was found in Shelley House in the garden, which was the right thigh. The next piece was actually found floating in the river by the police themselves on the 8th, same day as the Shelley House find, between Battersea Park Pier and Albert Bridge, floating in the middle of the river, about here. It's getting congested around here, isn't it? And the last part of all was again at Bankside, the right arm. It was found about here near the Blackfriars Bridge end of Bankside, and the arm is that arm that was folded up like this and tied up here. That arm, that was the one that was found there. So we can see there's quite a wide range here between Wandsworth and West India Dock Pier. A big collection in this area, in the Battersea area. Don't forget, I keep saying that this is where Tower Bridge is, and this is where there was a lot of building work going on because Tower Bridge was actually being constructed at the time. This is the Pool of London. This is the busy dock area. So getting past that is difficult. This was a big heavy part and it was almost certainly dumped that side. It wouldn't have got through. This part here could conceivably have floated up on the upcoming tide. There was a lesser blockage here where Battersea Bridge was being constructed, but that was a much less of a constriction on the river. I'll show you now where the locations we know for Elizabeth Jackson. One is, I mentioned, I went and visited it, Manilla Street, where she lived briefly after she came back from Ipswich. Here, isn't that curious? It's so close to where that part was found. That's very, I don't know what to make of it, but it's extremely curious and coincidental. The other places she was linked to, she was seen in Chain Walk by the lady who she got the ulster off. That's about here. Chain Row, I should say. She was seen in Turk's Row and probably lived in Turk's Row, which is in a lodging house, and was seen probably soliciting in Turk's Row, which was about here. And she was also seen by her mother in Queen's Road, which is now the Royal Hospital Road, which is about there. So that's where she, again, that was her main area of living. And this is the embankment that had lots of itinerants. She's probably living for a short while as an itinerant on the embankment here as well. So that puts her main area of living here, and that's where a lot of body parts are found. And the other one, strangely, where that other body part was found, where she lived as well. There's some strange connection going on there. I'll now add on the pieces for the Rainham Mystery. The first part was found way down, the heaviest part was found way down in Rainham, it's way off the map. I'll leave that piece there to indicate that. The next parts were found, the next one was in the river at Temple, about here, Temple Pier. Then there was a part found off Battersea Pier, right by Battersea Park. Then there were two parts, or several parts actually, found in the Regent's Canal around St Pancras, Regent's Park area, up here, just off the map up there. And then we have the Whitehall Mystery, where we had the first part was found at Pimlico, around here. And we had the two parts that were found, or several parts that were found in Scotland Yard, in the foundations of the East Scotland Yard building, about here on land. So I'm still sticking to black is mostly inland, white is mostly on the river. And lastly, look, I've done the wrong way around there, because the Rainham part was around the river. Lastly, I'm going to add the Pinchin Street Torso, which was about here inland. And this denotes the blockage by the Tower Bridge. Now, Inspector Tunbridge, who we've seen was in charge of the Jackson murder investigation, was brought in to view the Pinchin Street Torso, and other of the medical experts were as well. And they were all of the opinion that the mode of dismemberment in that case was the same, strikingly similar, as in the other three cases. The logic is that who did one did them all. And we have this, what can we say about the map here? What can we say about the map? There's an obvious big cluster around this area in Battersea, the Battersea area. There's also a bias for the parts that were dumped on inland on the north bank. There's only one part that was found on the south bank. That's the part that was found inland on the south bank. That's the part that was found in Battersea Park. Whereas on the north bank we have the part in Shelley House, we have the parts in the Regent's Canal, we have the parts in Scotland Yard, we also have the part that the Pinchin Street Torso. And the conclusion was that the culprit probably lived near the Pinchin Street near where the Pinchin Street torso was dumped. The Pinchin Street torso, as far as its dumping is depositing of the body, was quite an exception to the others, and bears all hallmarks of being dumped quickly, whereas the others were methodically put in the river with a sort of purpose behind putting them in the river. Or in the case of Scotland Yard, there was an obvious purpose there as well. Shelley House, I think Shelley House was dumped. He was going to dump it in the river. I just think he chucked it in the first garden he saw, because I think he was disturbed and didn't want to take the risk of chucking it in the river for whatever reason. There are obvious connections to the Jack Ripper murders. Similar type of victim, obviously in the same city. There's this thing of the flaps of skin, which I've mentioned, is how they were also described with Mary Kelly in her murder. I've gone on about this Venetian blind cord, near where Rose Milett was killed was a Venetian blind factory, if that's relevant. There are other issues to think about with the torsos. Did the killer know which parts would float, which bits would float better than others? Did he have knowledge of the tides and the currents on the river to judge when was best to throw them in? Did he know lightermen, for example? Did he chuck them from the bridge or from the side of the bank? It's quite a long drop. Did he do it at high tide or low tide? Did he perhaps go down the stairs and put them in? You have to bear in mind did he do it from the north bank or the south bank? You have to bear in mind that particularly in the Chelsea area there were a lot of itinerants sleeping rough, including Elizabeth Jackson, and it's not like that the riverside walls were vacant and there's no one about, so he had to choose his time and place when he got rid of these parts. So all these things you have to bear in mind when you think how this was done and indeed who did it. But we're going to come on to that and look at these details in greater depth to try and work out who may have done this, and in a future episode. We've already gone through the Pinchin Street torso in other episodes, but I'll touch on that in the next one as well. Anyway, in the meantime, thank you for watching, and please subscribe and share.